Okay, so you should not be ashamed of reading fan fiction. We are talking about fan fiction today and why no one talks about it. I grew up reading a lot of fiction, and eventually I stumbled onto the world of fan fiction on the internet, and I was immediately hooked. So I read hundreds of finished and unfinished fanfics about my favorite pieces of media, which at the time were Harry Potter and Percy Jackson. And I know a lot of people who have really similar stories of stumbling into fan fiction. Maybe it was about Doctor Who, or Twilight, or Harry Potter, or Game of Thrones, or The Hunger Games, or Star Trek, or Star Wars, or literally anything else. The weird thing is, we don't really talk about it. For me, I had a few close friends that I talked to about fanfiction that I read or maybe that they read, but we would not dare talk about it with anyone else. It was a secret. Eventually I stopped reading fanfiction, and I really stopped reading anything altogether. I didn't really view fanfiction as a real valid form of reading, and I don't think many other people did either. Recently, I have gotten back into reading, which is amazing, and it has me thinking about my brief stint in reading fanfiction, and honestly, I've come to the conclusion that I, like many of the people I know, was ashamed of reading fanfiction, and I stopped reading it because of that, and I also stopped reading it because I didn't view it as a real form of reading. I have also come to the conclusion that fanfiction is a lot more valuable than I realized it was. It's a form of entertainment, but it's also a form of gaining representation and learning to write, and honestly, I think it should be classified as a genre of fiction. Just to start y'all off, I want to introduce y'all to some very important texts and authors that I'm kind of going to continually reference throughout this. So the first one is Ursula K. Le Guin. So Le Guin is super cool. She's an early fantasy author, and she's known for writing fantasy, but also writing about fantasy. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of her essays on fantasy throughout this video. I'd also like to introduce you to Gabrielle Lissauer, who has written some really cool fantasy short stories and some webcomics, as well as the book The Tropes of Fantasy Fiction. And so she has some really interesting ideas about the genre of fantasy, and she has this idea where the whole genre has this meta text, or this established universe of terms and tropes that build up every single novel, whether or not they're adhering to those tropes or subverting them. I will also be referencing Harry Potter and Percy Jackson in this quite a bit, as those are the two pieces of media that I am the most familiar with as far as fan fiction goes. I know there are like a million pieces of media that have gotten people into fan fiction. Supernatural, Sherlock, may as well add in Doctor Who for like the OG super Who stands, and like Twilight, Star Trek, like literally so much. But Harry Potter and Percy Jackson were what I was into, and Harry Potter is actually the piece of media with the most fan fiction written about it, period. I have this little graph about it. It's actually really cool. So I think that Harry Potter is really representative of what the form of media, like a fan fiction as a form of media, can do. I'm also going to bring in a Harry Potter Percy Jackson crossover fan fiction that I discovered called The Coming of Nico D'Angelo. It's like 150,000 words, and the first Percy Jackson book is 82,000 for reference, so it's a lot of dedication, and this is kind of my introduction back into the fanfiction world. I found it and I was pretty interested, so I've been reading it for this video. And in this fanfiction, the demigods from the Percy Jackson series have been sent on a quest to go to Hogwarts and destroy Voldemort's Horcruxes. And it's kind of set in the 5th year of the Harry Potter series, and also after the end of the Heroes of Olympus series for Percy Jackson. It was written from 2015 to 2021, so it's definitely like a long-term passion project, and it's been my like rediscovery of fanfiction. It's been really enjoyable. I'm still in the middle of it right now, but I am thoroughly entertained. One of the things that first attracted me to fanfiction was queer representation. Most of the media that I read growing up had no queer people in it, and I realized that I was queer from a really young age, so I was craving that representation for so long, and I ended up finding it in fanfiction. The Coming of Nico D'Angelo actually does a lot in terms of gay representation. It explores Nico's sexuality and relationships as a core part of the plot. I read countless Harry Potter fanfictions with queer representation as well. That was a really big part of why I enjoyed fanfiction so much. And like I've even found queer slash fics of Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, which is like a classic like OG fantasy book. So there are hundreds of thousands of examples of queer representation just like this for so many different fiction pieces, and that's all represented by fan fiction. And it's why so many people that I knew read fan fiction, but the problem is a lot of us got shamed out of reading fan fiction, but that representation didn't get any better until recently, and even now it's not great, especially for genderqueer and trans people. Fan fiction is also how a lot of people of color seek representation in familiar stories. This is something that author Ebony Elizabeth Thomas touches on in her book The Dark Fantastic: Race and the Imagination, from Harry Potter to The Hunger Games. In the first chapter of this book, Thomas writes about her own experiences with fanfiction and seeking out representation for the non-white parts of the wizarding world of Harry Potter. She says, "As a fan of color, I was also curious about what the wizarding world might be like outside of England. Without colonialism or slavery, how on earth did black children end up at Hogwarts with English names? Adoption? Immigration? Or had witches and wizards of color been somehow subjugated? Was their magic less powerful?" She was looking for explanations of how people like her existed in this world in the exact same way that I was with queer representation. She goes on to say that some of this same curiosity and desire for representation is what led her to her dream of creating representation of her own one day, which I think is something that fanfiction is really good at inspiring. So, not only do I think fanfiction is a great option for people seeking representation, I think fanfiction allows people to learn how to write and explore a more creative side of themselves, like express yourself. There is some classically bad writing in fanfiction. My favorite example is My Immortal, which is like an infamous Harry Potter fiction from 2006. But overall, fanfiction just relies on a lot of cheesy tropes and unrealistic dialogue. But when you look at it from the perspective of people who are learning how to express themselves in writing, I think it gets vastly more interesting. One of these cheesy tropes is something called a Mary Sue. And if you don't know, a Mary Sue is basically a flawless character. She's someone who everyone is in love with, and she's brilliant and amazing and everything and perfect, and she's like 15 years old. This is the type of character that was actually created because of a Star Trek fan fiction that was like for this Star Trek magazine, and the zine owner, Paula Smith, wrote a Mary Sue character as a satire for the kinds of submissions that she was submitting for her zine. And there's this quote from the fan fiction that I think is hilarious, but this is written about the character named Mary Sue. "Captain Kirk, Dr. Spock, Dr. McCoy, and Mr. Scott, all weeping unshamedly at the loss of her beautiful youth and youthful beauty, intelligence, capability, and all-around niceness." And this is about this 15-year-old girl. It's so funny. Oh my gosh. These kinds of characters appear quite often in fanfiction, but they aren't as acceptable in the world of writing as a whole, which is something that Gabrielle Lissauer points out in her article in Luna Station Quarterly, which is another fantasy magazine. She frowns upon Mary Sues in published literature, but in fantasy fiction, she views them as breaking the rules of reality for the world. It's not like they're canon, and they're written for fun. They're written by people trying to make themselves worthy to be their favorite characters. And most importantly, she says that in fanfiction, Mary Sues are wish fulfillment and learning how to write, which is the exact point that I'm trying to make. They are unrealistic, but they are a part of learning to write. This is even something that Paula Smith, the original author of the Mary Sue story, expressed. She said in an interview with Smithsonian Magazine in 2019 that the Mary Sue characters actually seem to be a stage in writing for many people. It's a way of exercising who they are and what they can imagine themselves doing. Tropes like these are a starting point for writing and learning. Because the authors of fanfiction have the outlines of pre-existing plots and characters to jump off from, they have a lot of creative freedom and liberty to explore different writing styles and genres without getting hung up on more difficult things like world building and creating something new and innovative. The goal is simply to learn and entertain. There are actually a lot of very successful authors who started out by writing fan fiction. The most famous example, of course, is E.L. James, who wrote 50 Shades of Grey, and that series actually started out as a very elaborate Twilight fan fiction. But there are countless other examples. Meg Cabot, the author of The Princess Diaries, wrote Star Wars fan fiction. Marissa Meyer, the author of The Lunar Chronicles, wrote Sailor Moon fan fiction. And another quite recent example is Rainbow Rowell. And Rainbow Rowell wrote Carry On and Wayward Son, which are actually really recent gay representation in like young adult fantasy. But those two characters are actually fanfiction characters from another one of her books where the main character writes fanfiction, and Rowell herself also wrote fanfiction in her youth. Basically, there are so many authors who learned and grew from writing fanfiction. It's an incredible tool for that. The Percy Jackson fic that I've been looking at takes itself very seriously as far as writing goes. Like, the author clearly is writing with intention, with a real plan, a goal in mind. It's really nice. It's really interesting to read. And it was written, as I said, from 2015 to 2021. So it's a long-term passion project. And I'm sure as it goes on, the writing improves, which is incredible and such a cool way to learn how to write. And fanfiction is what brought that to the author. Okay, so fanfiction is amazing for representation, and it's amazing for learning to write. That alone, I think, makes it something that more people should embrace. Not necessarily partake if they don't want to, but no one should feel shamed out of reading or writing it. And fanfiction is still looked down upon as an invalid form of reading, and I just don't think that that should be the case. I think fanfiction, in its own unique way, is a subgenre of fantasy. I know that sounds like a stretch, but I don't think it's as far of a stretch as people think it is. Fantasy as a genre has really loose definitions. There are elements of the fantastic, dragons, magic, out of the ordinary things. Sometimes it's all in varying degrees. Sometimes it's a whole other world. Sometimes it's just the real world with one quirk. There's a whole broad range that fantasy can encompass. Ursula K. Le Guin defines fantasy as a genre as something that has no agreement to pretend that its story happened, might have happened, or might ever happen. It deliberately violates plausibility in the sense of congruence with the world outside the story. And what constitutes plausibility in fantasy is the coherence of the story, its consistent self-reference. And overall, it's just shamelessly fictive. For me, another really strong aspect of fantasy is its ability to connect with readers' emotions despite being completely unreal or unrealistic. I think that fantasy has a really special ability to do this. I also think that a big part of fantasy is its unique tropes and the metatext that Gabrielle Lissauer talks about in the tropes of fantasy fiction. The tropes in metatext become what Lissauer calls a mental dictionary of terms and concepts long agreed upon by previous authors who constantly build upon their predecessors' work. Here's the thing. All of this matches up with how I think about fanfiction pretty much exactly. As far as Le Guin's plausibility goes, I think that fanfiction has a very unique approach to establishing plausibility. Fanfiction is taking something that already exists and changing it to create something that is less plausible in the universe that it comes from. However, it is plausible in the world of that fanfiction. I think of plausibility as very similar to suspension of disbelief in the sense that there's only so much a viewer or reader can take before they can no longer enjoy a form of media because of the internal inconsistencies. I think that fanfiction uniquely stretches that suspension of disbelief for its readers. Everything becomes more plausible in fanfiction. Because the reader is aware that they are reading fanfiction, things don't have to be plausible in the original universe. They are plausible in the new author's universe. This is really evident, especially when authors are maybe combining two different fictional universes, like in The Coming of Nico D'Angelo. They have to create a whole new internal plausibility. In either of the source universes, the stories wouldn't make sense at all, but the author has set up new rules for the universe. In The Coming of Nico D'Angelo, this is the wizarding world. As it turns out, all of the wizards are followers of Hecate, the goddess of magic, and that's how the two worlds are able to collide in the way that they do. Fanfictions establish plausibility like this all of the time, and it mimics fantasy plausibility in a really interesting way. Fanfiction is also used as a tool for helping people deal with their emotions and express themselves. Fanfiction's representation is the main way that I see it displaying this characteristic of fantasy. Like being able to have an avenue for queer representation connects so deeply with readers, and oftentimes it's the only way that readers can connect with those emotions and complex thoughts because there is no other representation. The thing that really hits it home for me with fanfiction being a subgenre of fantasy is that tropes and established metatext play a huge role in fanfiction. There are dozens of tropes and terms that exist solely in fanfiction, or at least they started there. The Mary Sue characters that we talked about earlier are a classic fanfiction trope. Things like enemies to lovers plotlines, there was only one bed plots, they were roommates, alternative universe or AU fics, coffee shop meet cutes, YN or your name fics. Even the presence of author's notes as throughout fanfictions are a part of the established terms and tropes that all experienced fanfiction readers and writers understand. They literally have become the same mental dictionary that Lissauer talks about with metatext in fantasy. It's an incredible amount of world building and context, all for a media form that is entirely decentralized the same way fantasy is. Fantasy takes the real world and throws it out the window in order to create something new. Fanfiction does the exact same thing, but instead of throwing the real world out of the window, they are throwing an existing fiction's world out the window in order to expound off of it, which I think is so neat. I think they are creating the fantastic out of fiction rather than out of the real world, and in my opinion, that makes it a subgenre of fantasy. It even has its own little unique subgenre. So fantasy has comic fantasy or satire fantasy with Discworld, and fanfiction has the same thing with pieces like the Mary Sue piece or maybe My Immortal. It's so cool to have all of that in one area. So I think that fanfiction ultimately is one of those subgenres of fantasy. So yeah, those are my thoughts on fanfiction. If it's something you want to read, you should, and you shouldn't feel ashamed of it. If it's something you want to write, you should, and you shouldn't feel ashamed of it. It's a valid form of reading that offers real benefits like representation, and it's something that I consider to be a part of the fantasy genre, which may help other people see it as more real and more valid. But most importantly, fanfiction is entertainment, which is what reading is all about anyway.